Okay, awesome. I think we could go ahead and start now. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first session of the Africa Oxbridge Dialogues 2020. My name is Cynthia Okoye. I am Nigerian and a second year pharmacology PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and I am one of the facilitators for today's discussion. So, to start off, some ground rules for today. Please ensure that your microphones are muted when you're not speaking. And if you wish to speak during the Q&A session, please raise your hand first. Secondly, we ask that you respect other people's opinions, especially when you disagree with them. And please watch your language if you're making a response to these opinions. And so I'm going to share a bit about this program before I hand over to Iye, who's the second facilitator for today. So, Africa Oxbridge Dialogues is a collaboration between African and African diaspora students and alumni of the University of Cambridge and the University of Oxford. The series convenes a recorded schedule of discussions on issues concerning Africa and the African diaspora, and specifically will cover topics of social impact, racism, education, policing, and technology. Many academic institutions have established distance learning in response to the current pandemic, which also has led to the cancellation of the 2020 Africa conferences at Cambridge and Oxford. So this series leverages online platforms and this opportunity for reflection to critically engage in Africa and the diaspora. I now hand over to Iye, the second facilitator, who will introduce herself and the topic for today's discussion. Over to you, Iye.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. So my name is Iye, and I'm a first-year PhD student in sociology at the University of Cambridge. I'm a proud representative of Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Ghana. And I study self-employed young people in Ghana and Nigeria. And I have the pleasure of co-facilitating today's debate with Cynthia. So today our discussion will be centered on the topic. This house believes that past and present African scholars at Oxbridge have been able to move beyond the rhetoric of change on the continent. And so now I'll briefly read our opening statement to set the stage for our dialogue. When applying to study at Cambridge and Oxford, many of us wrote in our personal statements that we would like to come to these institutions to learn certain things to bring about change on the African continent. We are just part of many generations of African scholars that have come to these grand institutions with certain hopes and aspirations about the continent. How effective have Oxbridge scholars over time been in effecting change on the continent? Many Oxbridge scholars do not return to the continent on completing their studies for a myriad of reasons. Oxbridge students also form a part of the diaspora. Are Oxbridge Africans in the diaspora able to effect real change on the continent, or are we disconnected from the actual issues on the ground, the pressing problems, and the latest trends in thinking? Certain Oxbridge scholars have also returned to the continent and in many cases have become a part of Africa's elite. Have the Oxbridge Africans on the continent and also in diaspora been able to move beyond the rhetoric of change, or have simply been co-opted to perpetuate existing power structures? While it is true that a handful of African Oxbridge scholars do indeed pioneer initiatives to positively impact communities on the continent, the same cannot be said of the African societies at the Oxbridge institutions. The bulk of the engagement of the societies with the ongoing issues on the continent seem to start and end with dialogues such as this one. When and how do we as collective groups move beyond academic papers and debates and hit the ground with action? Finally, who is to say that Oxbridge have to change the continent? Must every African Oxbridge scholar carry the burden of a personal responsibility to bring about change on the continent? So that's what we'll be discussing today. So over to you, Cynthia.
All right, thank you, Iye, for the super introduction. Before we move on to the speeches, I'd like to take the opportunity to make a quick announcement about the upcoming sessions in this series so that you can mark your calendars. So on Wednesday, the 12th, that's this coming Wednesday at 6 p.m. British Standard Time, we will discuss the topic abolition, not reform, will dismantle systems of racialized policing in a time of Black Lives Matter. And then next week, Sunday, at this time, we will be discussing Africans are indifferent to racism in the diaspora. And then the last session, which will be the following Wednesday, will take place at 6 p.m. BST, and we will be discussing the new colonialism is technology. So yeah, just saying that in advance so that you can all mark your calendars and join in as well in those discussions. Okay, so that's it for announcements, and we shall now move on to the exciting part of today's events. We have a lineup of 5 speakers today, and what I'll do is I'll briefly introduce each of them just before they give their speeches, and each of them will speak for about 5 minutes, and then after all 5 of them have spoken, the floor will open up to the audience for questions and comments. So our first speaker today is Esther Anwuzia. Esther Anwuzia is from Nigeria and is a third-year PhD student in the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. Her research examines the influence of parents and teachers on the career choices, motivation, and well-being of adolescents in Nigeria. We're glad to be hearing from you today, Esther, and thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Okay, I thought you were good. Hi, everyone. I thought you were going to introduce all the speakers first and then ask us to start talking. But thank you, and thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Ie, for having me today, and it's a pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Esther again, and some of you know me. So this is this is an issue I believe we can all relate to, because I have also found myself in this dilemma of trying to figure out, after my PhD, do I stay back in Cambridge or do I go back to Nigeria? So I just want to start off with an opening quote. I don't know, from the very first feature of Spider-Man, actually. And it says, with great power comes responsibility. Now, what that means, in my opinion, is I would like to start off by saying it's not just about power and responsibility, but power and responsibility stems from knowledge. And this is where I want to kick off my opinion about this subject. Coming to institutions like Cambridge and Oxford gives us the privilege or access to certain kind of knowledge that we might not otherwise have access to if we were probably on the continent, and we need to recognize this fact. And having that knowledge is a resource, is a sort of capital, and we must realize that it translates into some kind of power, because when you're able to understand how something works and how it should work, you have some kind of power. That knowledge gives you some kind of power, and this is where we could get it wrong. Now, because power can be exercised responsibly or irresponsibly, and that's where responsible exercise of power comes into play. Understanding that there is some sort of elite or prestigious connotation that comes with an Oxbridge degree is something that we cannot ignore. And this is why it is very easy, like the opening statement for this session said, it is very easy to return to the continent, for example, and then only perpetuate existing power structures. And that's because an Oxbridge degree obviously has that elite connotation. So what I like to say is, there is something we need to realize called the responsible exercise of power. And that is when we need to understand your why. So it's not really about whether you go to the continent or you choose to stay back here, but how do you choose to use the tools and resources which your degree and your education has given to you? And because I don't think there's no rule saying that we need to go back, even though if you feel the need to go back, then you need to understand your why. And if you think you need to stay back here, you also need to understand your why. Because even on the continent, it's really divided. Some people think, oh, it's ridiculous for you to come back to the continent having left. But some people think, oh, you should come back to pass on what you have learned. But what I'd just like to emphasize is that at the end, personal responsibility is important, and recognizing that rather than just allowing yourself, unconsciously become an aristocrat, you need to realize that you have tools and resources that are useful, that can be useful to the world, wherever it is you choose to exercise this knowledge. You can be an advocate of change wherever it is, as long as you are responsibly exercising the tools and knowledge that your degrees have given to you. That's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Esther. Thank you so much for digging deep and openly sharing what this topic means to you. I think it's great that you touched on the fact that knowledge gives power, and that this comes with a personal responsibility. And I think what you've said, really resonates with many of us here. So thank you again, Esther.
You're welcome.
Okay, so now we should move on to the second speaker, Dr. Grace Nzumura. Dr. Mzamura is a graduate of the Malawi College of Medicine with a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery. She is a Weidenfeld and Hoffman Scholar and graduate of the University of Oxford with an MSc in International Health and Tropical Medicine. During her studies, she was interested in international development and vaccinology. During her stay in Oxford, she represented the university as a student fellow for the 2019 SCOL World Forum for Social Entrepreneurship. She also represented her college at the All Innovate Idea University competition, the Oxford Satellite Battle of Ideas debates, and the Weidenfeld and Hoffman annual town hall debates. She would like to develop in academic medicine and is interested in researching and contributing to health policies in Malawi. Yeah, this is amazing. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mzamura, and I hand the floor over to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So when I was applying for a master's degree in the UK, I knew that I wanted to expand my scope of expertise, and I knew that I wanted to find out my fullest potential. I was fortunate enough to land like a full scholarship at the University of Oxford, and it's now a place that is dear to my heart. In my class, in my scholarship, in my college, I became, as we all become, part of an elite board of students, even though I never felt like that way. It made me believe that I was destined to do great things or to change my country, even though I wasn't sure what that would be. But during the time in Oxford, I went to a couple of conferences and talks about Africa. So for someone who is just discovering what the world has to offer, it is mesmerizing, and you don't really know what Africa is until you see a whole lot of us in one space, much like this talk is now. My most memorable Oxford Africa centered events are the Africa Business Forum and the Oxford Insaka. At these events, I saw people like Vera Songwe, who is the UN Executive Secretary for Economic Commission for Africa, and Aruma Otea, who is a Said Business School academic scholar and former Vice President Treasurer of the World Bank. At the Oxford Insaka, I was inspired by Professor Shadrach Chirikure, who gave us lessons about archaeology in Africa and why Africa is poor today. And we also had fellows like Dr. Paley, who is a librarian and is teaching about writing books to teach children about anti-corruption. What these experiences teach you is that Oxbridge scholars have great passion in their fields, and that is obvious to all of you. But what it does is that it allows Africans to take up spaces in discussions about our continents. And only a few decades ago, we wouldn't be able to contribute to those spaces. We're contributing today to fields of science, and we're telling our own stories, and we're showing the world how excellent Africans can be, and we're leaving our mark in the world. On the other hand, what bothered me was that it would be nearly impossible to have the same experiences at home as in Africa. And if we do not have meaningful platforms or collective discourse at home, can we really provide meaningful change on the continent? The challenge we have is something Dr. Vera Songwe said about Africa, that we're not integrating with each other within the continent as we are integrating with other continents. As Oxbridge scholars, we are seeking excellence indeed and succeeding on our own, but more could be done as a collective to bring out meaningful change on the continent. But then that begs the question, what is change and how do we measure it? Does individual prosperity account as change, or is change only about the direct influence that Oxbridge scholars have on the continent? Even then, what is direct influence? What about paying back your black tax, so to speak? So for a lot of people, deciding to stay home or deciding to leave, in a sense, is also about finding a place where you can grow individually and give back the most. So for example, if your family needs like £100 to survive every month, do you settle for £100 job at home, or do you live on £1,000 abroad and be able to send £100 at home every month? That balance is about generational wealth that a lot of us do not have. And even though we are striving to change the continent, we realize that giving back means we have to work a whole lot harder than what people from other continents have to do. I believe that in many ways, we do more for our direct communities or families than can be measured on a larger scale. The question then is that, is it our responsibility to contribute on a larger scale? And how do we share that responsibility? How do we know that we represent Africa? We still represent Africa when we are away from Africa. There is a blog by Priscilla Sempere. I can leave it in the chat. It's titled, Dear African Abroad, Home is Not Waiting for You. It discusses how Africans abroad want to change Africa, but the more they stay abroad, they feel lost and realize that Africa will move on with or without them. As Oxbridge scholars, we have the opportunity and the platform that is world renowned. There is no shortage of African leaders that come to Oxbridge corridors every week and on different platforms or conferences. We're aware of that. So apart from discussions like these, what should we do to turn those discussions in Oxbridge into meaningful policy changes? Unfortunately, we all know the state of the African Union and our various regional bodies. If those regional bodies are not dedicated to achieving goals that they set, or while they have the power to advance them, what can we do as Oxbridge or elite students, as other people will see? What can we do differently? So maybe we can figure out how to use those platforms as an Oxbridge community to bring together those policymakers that are on our corridors all the time, to bring together those policymakers and our research knowledge, and maybe that can translate to meaningful policy changes.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm glad that you particularly mentioned the idea of supranational identity. I think that's another thing that resonates with us, the idea that you don't necessarily feel African until you sort of leave the continent. And also, I think also talking about the individual prosperity versus seeking social impact, I think that's definitely a dilemma that many of us do face. So thank you for vocalizing and highlighting this. And yes, and ways that we can come together to influence social policy. So thank you, Dr. Mzamura, for sharing these important insights. So our third speaker today is Kwabena Kusi-Mensah. Kwabena is a board-certified psychiatrist with additional training in child and adolescent mental health based in Kumasi, Ghana. He undertook his medical training at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Kumasi, and his residency training in psychiatry in Ghana and Nigeria. His passion for children's mental health led him to establish the first multidisciplinary child and adolescent mental health clinic integrated into a general hospital in Ghana in 2017. Currently, Kwabena is a first-year PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, where he is working on developing culturally appropriate tools for assessing frontal lobe, so this is part of the brain, functioning for children and adolescents in West Africa, as well as risk factors affecting cognition and mental well-being. His career goal is to be a leading physician scientist, working to build local research capacity and be an advocate for young people's mental health in the West African sub-region. So excellent. We are delighted to have you here today, Kwabena, and we look forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Right. So thank you for the introduction. I think it's been a good discussion so far. I have just 5 minutes. This is a very, very packed topic, to be honest. And I did write a speech, but I don't know, it seems drab to me. So I'm just going to go with the highlights of what I want to bring on board. I guess I will say upfront that the major, I guess the most provocative, but it may not be so provocative because some of the previous speakers have highlighted it. But I mean, I should be open enough to say that I stand on the side of, I think that the question of whether Africans, we can make impact abroad or at home, I think it's a yes or no question, but I think the answer lies closer to the yes than to the no. In other words, throughout this talk, I'm going to be advocating very strongly that the most impact that we can make as Africans is back home. I'm hoping to get the chance to expound upon that more and more, but I think it ties in with the other prompts that you sent as well with the pack. There have been many scholars over the years, Oxbridge scholars over the years who have come here. As you rightly said, many have stayed back, some have gone back home. From the Ghanaian perspective, a lot of the change that we have seen in Ghana, so far as our political and governance institutions are concerned, have been led by Oxbridge alumni. We transitioned from military rule into democracy, led largely by the people who sort of drafted the constitution, the current Ghanaian constitution, which has endured, by a number of Oxbridge scholars. There was Kwame Ahoy, who was a master's student in Oxbridge. There was Chachu Chikata, a famous lawyer. He was single-handedly responsible for the Constitution of Ghana. And they convinced the leaders, the military leaders at that time, to transition. Now, even transition, of course, we know that democracy, having elections alone doesn't make democracy. You need to have an entrenched institutions that is able to hand over power to opposition and so on and so forth. Even in that process, where, I mean, Ghana seems to have deepened its democratic governance over the years. It's been pioneered largely by Oxbridge scholars. So in 2008, the economic transformation that took place, Dr. Bawumia, the current vice president, had his master's in Oxford. The current president of Ghana spent some time in Oxford as well, even though he didn't graduate. So that's a different question altogether. But the point that I'm making is that, yes, there has been some limited change. And generally, I mean, we would all agree that the march in Africa is leaning more and more towards democratic governance and away from the coups and military rule and things like that. I'm saying all of this just to help us remember or highlight the point that important change has taken place in Africa. That is not as much as we would have liked. Certainly, Africa is not where any of us would want to see it. There's still a lot to be done, but we have made some advances, and Oxbridge scholars have been involved in that. But see, that goes back to the point that I made at the beginning, that I feel that it's not enough, precisely because not enough of us are staying or going back home. There are loads of diasporan Africans out there, and they are doing excellently well. And I like the point that Grace made about, I mean, it's been a tension between your own personal advancement and things like that. I don't want it to sound like I'm belittling the need to personally advance. And the truth is that in many of our countries, that opportunity is not there. I'm sure we'll talk about it as we go along. The industries that we are learning in, if I'm going to do some really advanced molecular physics or something, we don't even have the labs in Africa to do that kind of research. So I'm not taken away from that fact. But the truth of the matter is, if you take the US, for example, Chicago, there are more Ghanaian doctors in Chicago than all of Ghana. Well, now the numbers have bridged up, but if you take all of the US, there are more Ghanaian doctors, there are more Nigerian doctors in America than there are in Nigeria. And the question is, many of these people are all people who I'm sure at some point in time felt like, oh, let me go out there, I can send money home, I can make an impact back home. But how much has that changed back home? And we can be honest with ourselves. There are loads of people, well-meaning Africans out there who are willing to help, who have developed the networks, the money, the capital to help. But because there are not enough, there's not enough of a critical mass of change agents back home, our pace of change is very slow at best and non-existent at all. And so I would be arguing very forcefully that, I mean, and this is not to sound, I mean, even for my own personal self, it's a struggle. You have opportunities that are opening up for you over here. I mean, it's not I cannot guarantee that I will go back. I will definitely go. I mean, I want to go back home, but I'm trying to make the point that it's not a self-righteous, we must all go back home. But I think if we are honest with ourselves and recognize the fact that there are loads of people like us who have already made this journey through Oxbridge, through other fascinating, amazing institutions, and stayed on in the West. And there are not enough of us back home who will be the change agents, because however many of us are out there, if there aren't people on the ground who have the right mindset, the right knowledge to link up with our compatriots out there, nothing is going to happen. And that's the truth. And so, yes, we need diasporans. You can make some level of change from the diaspora. I know quite a number of people, I mean, from the Ghana context, but I have just 5 minutes, so I'll, not go too much into it. But the point that I'm making is, if we recognize the reality that at some point in time, we will be needed on the ground back home, and start thinking in that mindset, even if we do decide that our immediate needs and immediate goals require that we stay here for a while, but we are working towards going back home. That is certainly a far better and a far more realistic appraisal of the situation that we need than living in some sort of pipe dream that we can also join the masses of people who have emigrated outside of the continent, and somehow Africa is going to transform itself, because it's not. There have to be people on the ground. And we have made progress, but there's a lot more that can be done. And it will require all of us doing our bit, whichever way or whichever direction that we want to take that from. So I think I'll stop here and yield the floor. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kobena, for such a passionate speech and for all the ideas you've laid out. Yes, I think it's good that you've highlighted that important change has already taken place and you've given a few examples. And I think it's also good that you sort of stated the point that the pace of change does correlate, with people who are, ready to go back and act as change agents. And I think also it's starting to have this idea of, well, how can we make change? Do we have to be physically present to cause change? I think that's an important idea that's also coming through from your speech. But yes, I'm sure that many of these points that have been raised are already stirring some rich comments and questions. And yeah, we would engage with this in the discussion. So thank you so much again, Kwabena. Okay, so our fourth speaker is Nongolo Ntaka. Okay, so I'm sorry, Nongolo. Am I saying your name right? Just to make sure.
Hi, my name is Nokolo.
Okay, Nongolo.
Yes.
Okay, so Nongolo holds 2 master's degrees in African and Political Studies from the University of Oxford and Wits University, respectively. She completed her undergraduate and honors degree in Economics and Political Studies at the University of Cape Town. Nongolo currently works as project manager and at Democracy Works Foundation, leading the organization's newest project, a civic education and dialogue program aimed at upskilling youth across South Africa annually. As a young scholar and professional, she has over 3 years of combined experience in research, program management, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. Nongolo is passionate about creating sustainable impact, and in 2019, she was recognized as part of the Mail and Guardian's top 200 most promising young South Africans under 35. Wow, super. We're thrilled to have you here, Nongolo, and the microphone is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Cynthia. As Cynthia mentioned, my name is Nokolo. And I guess I'll start by saying that I think there's no right or wrong answer, particularly in this discussion, as well as because I think it's a very complex issue when you look at the reasons of why African scholars decide to stay on the continent after leaving Oxbridge, or also why they decide to stay abroad. And I say it's complex because I think if you look at ordinary Africans who didn't study at Oxbridge, there's a lot of social, economic, and also political reasons for why they themselves choose to migrate elsewhere abroad. And I think that is something that's central to the discussion that we can't really ignore when we have this conversation. So I think it then becomes also important for us to, I think, reflect on the contributions of African scholars who studied at Oxbridge historically. As young Africans ourselves, I think we form part and we come from a lineage of prominent African scholars who've studied at Oxbridge over the years and who sought to pursue further study. Most notably, I think, if you look at past Oxbridge scholars, you would look at Pixie Seme, who studied at Oxford, who was the founder of the African National Congress, which was a prominent liberation movement in South Africa's struggle. You look at Kofi Abrefa-Busiwa, who was the Prime Minister of Ghana. You look at Femi Fani-Kayode, who was, the Nigerian Minister of Aviation and also a Special Assistant to President Obasanjo. You look at British Ghanaian scholar and philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah. And I think when we start to see ourselves as part of the broader community of these past scholars who studied at Oxbridge, the central question that we should then begin to ask ourselves is, what contributions have they made in Africa, looking at the social, the political, and the economic landscape? And how has this situation changed? And also, what becomes of us in terms of the burden? Is it a burden to bear for us to expect ourselves to actually make the contributions in the continent? And I think for me, particularly, my interest for studying at Oxford was because of wanting to, I was curious. Secondly, I wanted to look for an opportunity in terms of applying to an institution that was world-renowned and using the knowledge that I gained upon studying at Oxford to then come back to my country and to make a difference in that regard. I think for a long time, the history of Africans at both Cambridge and Oxford can't be separated. They've long attracted scholars, and they've also begged the question as to whether or not there is enough change that is being made by Oxbridge scholars. I think my answer to this would be two-pronged. So I think the first thing would be, if we look at the admissions rates of how many scholars Oxford and Cambridge admit in terms of African scholars, the admissions rate aren't so much as high. And so I think it also begs the question of how much then contribution can we make as Oxbridge scholars? Is there enough of us? What kind of contribution are we looking to make? I think the second thing that I would say is that I believe that it is important to come back to the continent to make a difference. If you look at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, they released a report in 2018. And on an annual basis, it was speaking to Africa's brain drain. And it spoke to the fact that statistically over 70,000 people, Africans, immigrate on an annual basis abroad, seeking better opportunities for economic, social, but also for political reasons. And I think that, yes, you can make change in the diaspora. Friends of mine who are African nationals but grew up in the UK are trying to connect and make change in the continent. I look at organizations like the Promoja Network that works with young African professionals in the diaspora seeking to address high unemployment rates in the continent, and how they're trying to link trying to create a connection in that regard. But I do think that with that being said, if we are facing a brain drain as a continent, there is a lot to be said in terms of then who does the burden lie to make a difference on? And yes, it may be a big burden for us as Oxbridge scholars, or too much to expect for African scholars who've studied abroad. But I don't think that the burden will lay on anyone else other than us. And I know that, some might say that, bearing this in mind, other scholars don't have the burden from other countries to return to their countries. But I think that if we are to look at issues around social issues, unemployment being one of our highest issues, we do have a duty as Africans who have gained the networks, the knowledge, to actually make sustainable impact and change in the continent. Change that doesn't perpetuate existing elite structures that we see now in terms of political networks, economic networks, but looking to address some of the key issues that are being faced in terms of poverty, unemployment, and looking at how do we then use the skills that we've gained in these institutions to actually make and bring about that kind of change. And so I think our role as young people who have studied at these institutions should be to work with people in the diaspora who have interests and are passionate about bringing about change, but also have a duty to actually come back to the continent and work towards this. And I say this, but also being cognizant of the fact that there are a myriad of reasons why Africans themselves would choose to leave the continent. And those are reasons that I don't think we can particularly ignore, but should be also central to this discussion around how do we then address those issues as Oxbridge scholars, particularly these reasons being the precarity of life in Africa. If you look at, I was speaking about earlier on, if you look at ordinary Africans who decide to actually risk their lives to actually travel by sea to Italy, in order to seek for a better life. I think that bears testament to the socioeconomic issues as to why Africans are looking elsewhere in terms of bettering themselves, bettering their lives. And so I think as Oxbridge scholars, we need to start addressing those issues, particularly in terms of what kind of impact can we make in terms of, one, addressing the brain drain, in terms of looking at how to address systemic issues that face our countries, that face the continent, and also what should the role of Oxbridge scholars be in terms of imagining a world, I think, that is better than that. And I think a large part of our duty should be to imagine, having attained this knowledge, is to not just perpetuate the power structures, but to reimagine a society where we can make the world a better place, and also where we can work with people in the continent in terms of addressing these challenges. I think I'll just leave it there for now.
Awesome, thank you. I appreciate that you've given examples also of Oxbridge alumni who are on the ground. And I also like this idea you talked about the low numbers of African Oxbridge scholars to begin with. I also really appreciate that, how you mentioned that people do leave the continent for different reasons, and then we seem to always talk about this topic in a way that we then place it as a burden or expectation for African scholars, which other scholars may not necessarily carry. But yeah, overall, you've given a very balanced take on this topic. So thank you very much for doing that and for bringing all those important ideas to light. Okay, so our final speaker for today is Gilbert Omwari. Gilbert obtained his LLB from the University of Nairobi and an MSc in Comparative and International Education from St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. He leads the Africa Justice and Restoration Trust, which offers pro bono legal representation for remand prisoners in Kenya's prisons. In his work there, he has helped release more than 40 people from prison in 2019. He is also the managing partner at Mitula, Sacco and Associates Advocacy. He brings a robust background as a law lecturer at Riara University, education innovator, and as a pro bono criminal defense advocate of the High Court of Kenya. Gilbert is passionate about criminal law and criminal justice reform in Kenya, with a particular interest in the right to legal representation and how this affects fair trial and access to justice in Kenya. Incredible. So thank you for joining us, Gilbert, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. Now, I really have just tried to focus on the question of the rhetoric of change. And to be able to focus on this, I'm going to just try and use my story. So before I left Kenya for Oxford, I was in the education space, and I was really focused on what education reform looked like at the time, because Kenya was working to get a new curriculum on board, which is still in the process of sort of being onboarded. And I had a background in law. And so the questions that kept coming at me were things I wasn't qualified for. So when I decided to go to Oxford and to make my application, it was so that I could know more about the education space and then contribute to what the education reforms look like. And my time in Oxford was beneficial. It was tough, but I made it through. And just leaving Oxford, the questions I kept asking myself, I'm sure are questions that many have asked and will continue to ask myself, of what happens after I leave? Where do I go? What do I do with my life? Is my life now international, or do I just go back home? Is it boring to go home? And what do I do? So I had a job when I was leaving the UK, which was so my last day in the UK as Oxford student was on the 29th of March, 2018, but I came back to Kenya with a job working for a scholarship trust, and essentially working towards building young scholars who are on a pathway into getting into UK universities at the undergraduate level. But while I was doing this work, just in 2018, I came across someone who told me the story of this guy called Brian Stevenson and the work he was doing with the Equal Justice Initiative around helping people who are wrongfully incarcerated get out, people who've been in prison for a long time. And I said, well, what's the situation in Kenya? And I found out that, the numbers were terrible and something needed to be done. So I said, well, I think I could do it, so let me try and do it. And that's how I ended up accepting to start the Africa Justice and Restoration Trust. Now, this essentially is just an organization that gets innocent, unjustly accused people out of prison. And as you've heard from my profile so we started March 2019 actively working. We're now in August of 2020, we've gotten about 55 people out of prison since last year. So how does this answer the question, does this rhetoric, are we going beyond the rhetoric of change? Obviously, in my applications, the story was always, yes, I'm coming back to Kenya. I want to change this in education law and policy and so forth. And I think I've managed to do it to the extent that I ended up also becoming a lecturer in the university. And I specifically teach education law and policy, but I also advise many people in those spaces on how they should go about, whether it is, they should go about their programs or businesses in that space, but also because there is something specific that I'm doing about the criminal justice space as a lawyer. And so I think it is possible that young African scholars or African scholars in general at Oxbridge would come back and make a difference. And the other thing that I just want to focus on is someone who really inspired me, because I worked for I worked for Beacon Equity Trust, which is a scholarship foundation, and I worked with a lady called Dr. Susan Kiragu Kanayo, who did her MPhil and her PhD at Cambridge. And when Dr. Sue left Cambridge, because she had worked for CAMFED, she had worked for Commonwealth, and she came back to Kenya and said, yes, I'm going to work for Beacon, but what I'm also going to do is to start a school called Children in Freedom Academy, which reimagines what education looks like for a young African. And you can see them with their kitenge, school uniforms, and you can see them learning about Mekatilili wa Menza and all these historical figures. And you can see that clearly she's gone out into Nakuru, which is not necessarily the capital city of Kenya, it's a town. And she's doing something out there with what she's learned out of all her years of experience. So the questions that we must ask ourselves are, what are our expectations when we're going there, and when you've completed? What expectations, what ideas have we built up in our minds, and how do we expect to live them out in a realistic sense? Because obviously you also come back and there's the experience of a system rejecting you because they think that you have high expectations now that you came from Oxford, and thinking, you want too much money, we can't hire you because you came from Oxford and you're carrying a brand. You also are aware as an Oxford graduate that you are carrying a brand, and that the expectations that come with that brand. And for many people, that's a reality of their existences. So it's really a value question. Am I going to give value, but also am I going to get value that offers me the kind of life experience that I want? Because your education is not just for everyone, it's also for you. It's for you to do well. And if it doesn't fulfill you, then what's the point of doing it? Well, if this advancement doesn't work for you, then why are you doing it in the first place? So it's value for me and then value for other people, and finding a balance on how the two coexist. And the question that I've also seen is, what role do you play? Because must it be an active role in that you are in country, or can you support? For example, there are many people who are in Oxford now who are supporting the work that I'm doing in Kenya, even if they're not necessarily actively participating in it, and in the sense of advising, in the sense of giving fresh ideas, in the sense of growing the network that we have, because we also have to fundraise while we're here. We have to do other things. And one of the things that I just want to finish with, because I don't want to speak, I've spoken beyond my 5 minutes, is that being at Oxford gave me a platform, but it also gave me access. It also put me in a position where I said I went to Oxford, and people then turned and listened, because that is something that they recognize and respect. And so obviously being able to leverage on these sorts of experiences to then advance this rhetoric and this opportunity would then make all the sense in the world. So I would say, yes, African scholars have gone beyond the rhetoric of change, but for many, it's not been an easy experience. I guess for me, it hasn't been either, but it is possible. And I think it's something we should still continue to pursue.
Great, thank you. Such inspiring work. I think Baron Stevenson's work on EJI is super amazing, and it's great to see how you were inspired by his work and stayed true to it. So thank you so much, Gilbert, for joining us today, and for sharing about the super amazing work you're doing in Kenya. I liked how you mentioned that Oxbridge does give us privilege and access, and we can leverage these in so many ways, but we do have to think about what expectations and how realistic are these that we can use this to move forward. So I'm sure that many of us have been inspired and encouraged from all that you've shared. So thank you again, Gilbert. Okay, so many thanks to our 5 speakers who have shared so excellently and inspirationally. We are especially grateful because they are putting themselves out here. They have really prepared for this, and this is something that they actually volunteered to do. So thank you again. You all are amazing. So we shall now move on to the open discussion session, which will be facilitated by EA. So over to you, EA.
Thank you, Cynthia. So now we'll just move straight into the discussion. I'm sure people have burning comments. They would like to share ideas and how they would like to contribute to the debate. So without further ado, if you could just raise up your hand, and then I will call upon you, and then you can make your contribution, your comment, or you can ask your question. You can direct individually to a speaker, or you can direct it more generally, and then we'll just take maybe 1 or 2 speakers to respond to your question, or if it's a comment, you can just share. So thank you. I've seen Simpiwe. If you could go ahead, Simpiwe. Simpiwe.
Sorry, I'm here. I did not think that you would ask me first, but thank you very much. Hi, my name is Simpiwe. I'm a DPhil student from Eswatini at the University of Oxford. And I guess I have 2 questions. The first is to Nokolo. It's Women's Day in South Africa. The scholars list or the alumni list that you read was very gendered. It was mostly men. So do you think it's true that African men who study at Oxbridge tend to benefit more from the studies? And do you think that they're better able to leverage the opportunity because they aren't experiencing the dual oppression of patriarchy and structural racism? And then my second question, more broadly.
Can you just repeat your first question? The network, sorry.
Okay, no worries. Not load shedding, just network. Okay, I'll read it slowly. So it's Women's Day in South Africa. The scholars list or the alumni list that you read was very gendered. It was mostly men. Do you think it's true that African men who study at Oxbridge tend to benefit more from the studies or are better able to leverage the opportunity because they aren't experiencing the dual oppression of patriarchy and structural racism? And then my second question, more broadly to whomever wants to pick it up from the speakers, is based on an article by a young South African writer, Tsepo Madlingozi, who wrote about Eskia Mphalele's work. So Eskia was a prolific South African intellectual who introduced this idea of the first exile and explained that the first goal of colonialism is to separate indigenous people from their economic ways of understanding the world and ultimately from themselves. And then, W.B. Du Bois in the US spoke about the same thing in terms of double consciousness. So my question to the rest of you is, what does it take to step outside of the first exile that we might be socialized into as Oxbridge graduates? And do you have any best practices from your field for counteracting these systems of exile or double consciousness? Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Simpiwe. So Noxolo, if you could go ahead, and then maybe we could take another person to respond to the second question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for that question, Simpiwe. So I think firstly, I don't think it's true that African men are better able to leverage at the opportunities that are given to them. But what I will say is that just in terms of my reflection of coming from South Africa, where, today is Women's Day, but a lot of questions surround that, particularly because of the fact that we have one of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the country. We are also, have high rates of rape against women and children. And so I think that speaks to the broader systemic issue that we are facing, which I don't think is exclusive to South Africa, but speaks to, I think, one, patriarchy, and also how systems still remain gendered in the country. And so what you'll see is that you'll find that there are a lot of men in structures of power, particularly in the political space, the social space, and the economic space, and that have not made way for women to actually take up those positions of power. And so I think for me, the broader question in this regard is when we are looking at issues around Oxford scholars, the number of African women who study at Oxford, is also is when they go back to their countries, is the systems that are there in place open enough for women to actually be able to lead? And I think my answer to that is necessary. It's no. And also, when I was actually looking on this list, and I was looking particularly at Oxbridge scholars who studied in the past, and I was searching for it, I actually found the list to be very gendered. And it's not a surprise that it was very male-centered as a result of that. And so I think that in this conversation in particular, when we look at the opportunities that are there, and also I think that we can't separate it from, I think, the intersection of race, class, and gender, and how those plays out in institutions, and who gets opportunity and who doesn't get opportunity, and also looking to redress that. I think to your second question, in terms of Du Bois' notion of double consciousness, I did my thesis at WITS actually on the experiences of Black women who studied in secondary schooling in post-apartheid South Africa. And I think for me, I've always been interested in the notion of double consciousness, particularly because I've always thought of myself to be as someone who is both in and without, to have opportunities in terms of studying in elite institutions, but also coming from a socioeconomic background that doesn't mirror that. And so I think also the same goes with you when you are an Oxford scholar and you go back into the continent, and the duality that you have between carrying the title of having studied at Oxford and coming back into the continent, hoping to bring about change, and also the perceptions that people hold of what it means for you to have studied at Oxford, and also for you to not particularly, I would say, either perpetuate certain existing structures or try to not actually make a difference. I think for me, so the work that I do, I work with young people across South Africa, across geographic location. And I think that the work that we do is trying to increase the access and also the knowledge of young people when it comes to political institutions in South Africa and institution building. And so I think that when you look at that, it's also looking at the work that you do and using that in terms of ensuring that when you are working with young people, you have as diverse a range of young people in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of location. And also ensuring that the leadership programs that we create don't necessarily perpetuate existing norms where, you know, it either has a certain aspect of young people who either would have studied in university or doesn't have young people who don't have a degree qualification. And so I think for us, you know, and the work that we do at the foundation has been trying to bridge that gap in terms of ensuring experiential learning, cross-pollination of ideas, but also ensuring that young people, irrespective of where they studied, actually have an opportunity to engage and also take part in discussions around South Africa's development agenda.
Okay, thank you so much, Noxolo. I think we'll just move on to the next question because you've given quite a comprehensive response. So Martin?
Thank you for the opportunity. I am affiliated to the University of Cambridge. So I'll make this quick. This question is addressed to any of the speakers to whom they feel touched by it. So first, do you feel obligated as part of this process of going beyond the rhetoric of change to take part in the political leadership of your respective countries, or are you not? And two, what is your philosophical leaning concerning your place in Africa? Do you think that going beyond the rhetoric of change is just a matter of philanthropy, where you try to do your due diligence because of your recently acquired privileged status, or is it due to a deep desire of Pan-Africanism? Yes, so that is it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Martin. I don't know which of the speakers would like to go. Okay, Grace.
First of all, the question about politics. I think it depends on one's country, where you're from, your type of the type of politics in your country, and also personal affiliation. Some people do want to go into politics, and that's fine. For me personally, I don't. I've never really wanted to. Also, okay, we're Africans, we have tribes and stuff, and I'm not from the particular tribe that would essentially do really well in politics. So no, it would be a no for me. In terms of giving back as philanthropy, um, I feel I've struggled with this issue personally, which is why I volunteered to give the talk, and I still struggle with it. I feel that a part of me feels like I want to maybe give 5 years into working in Malawi, and then see if I could do work more internationally, or because of what I said about being able to take up spaces in different platforms. Say you want to work with the WHO or the World Bank or the UN, there's a point at which you realize that those institutions play a big role in our continent. And I've always believed that we deserve, or we should be able to be in certain positions that have a say in our countries or where we're from. And they can't make decisions about us when we are the ones who are from Africa. We are the ones that can say something about where we're from. We're the ones that can give a better context to the countries where we're from, and we can, give better answers. And I think that we deserve to take those places. So it's a balance. Some people choose not to stay at home at all, and that's fine. Some people choose to go back immediately. It's still personal. It's difficult to answer, but I guess it's different for everyone. But for me, politics would be a no.
Okay, thank you so much, Grace. Any other person? Any other speaker? Okay, Gilbert.
Yeah,
and then Kwabena, we can take you.
Sorry, Kwabena, let me just go. Do I feel obligated to participate in politics? I think the question is structured politics, because in the world I exist in, everything is political. And it just depends on how you address what those politics are, and really how you relate that to power. So for me, I do address power issues. And how do I do this? Now, part of the work my organization does is to partner with about 16 social justice centers across Nairobi. And the social justice centers are dealing with questions like police brutality, criminal justice reform, the right to water, and socioeconomic rights. And how do we organize and educate these people so that from the point of understanding and even privilege that I may have of the comforts that I have experienced, or of understanding what legal obligations government has, how do I educate and support these people so that they can understand what's going on? And how does this fit into the larger political rhetoric and conversations that are going on? Now, do I personally believe that I should be in politics? I don't think that's something I'm ready for. It could be possible, but it's not something that I'm gunning for now. And it's not something I feel obligated to participate in so much as a graduate of Oxford, as a citizen of my country, so that I would participate as a Kenyan and not necessarily as a graduate of the University of Oxford. And the other thing I want to say is that on the question of first exile double consciousness and the whole philanthropy and Pan-Africanism, I see such a connection in that when you are close to the people that you are a citizen with, when you are close to the issues of your country, then it doesn't necessarily become philanthropy so much as comradeship, and realizing the fact that it is a battle that we are all fighting together, but just from different positions, and sometimes within the context of power structures. So it could be a chessboard or a drafts board, but it's still something that we're all fighting together. And that the important thing is always to stay proximate and close to the people who are suffering the most or who are the most disadvantaged, to understand what change needs to look like, especially in instances where you're coming from a privileged position. For example, just seeing where I'm coming from and some of the quote unquote comforts I've had, what does that mean for the people who have absolutely nothing and I need to be able to lose some of my privilege to make sure they gain something, and get seen as human, because that's the reality, is that we're all humans in a similar struggle. I think that's just a bit of what I would say in response.
Okay, thanks, Kwabena, and then Esther would like to say something.
Yeah, so thanks for the floor. Yes, I think politics is a neutral thing, and I think it's the exercise of power. Personally, I would want to get involved in politics, not immediately, at some point in time in the future. And my thinking is that it's because I think that, a lot of the things that we have discussed, a lot of the problems with Africa, structural and otherwise, is leadership, really. Yes, every society gets the leaders that it deserves, quote unquote. The leaders comes from the society. But at the same time, if you have a situation where the nature of your politics in your country is so bad and tends to produce bad leaders, then how are we going to change it? By getting into that leadership position to change the structures. Unfortunately, is leaders who have exerted a large amount of, I would say a disproportionate amount of influence on the structures. If we are going to build enduring structures and institutions in Africa, I like to give the example. So like in Ghana, for example, we have an executive president who, by virtue of the fact that the constitution that was written for a military dictator, all of the power, almost all of the power, is centered in the president's hands. Our president is essentially an elected king. He appoints 5,000 individual positions in that country. If you win an election in Ghana, you are basically an absolute monarch for 4 years. Now, that is wrong. That means that leaders change that needs to be felt at the very local level. Even our district chief executive, so which is I won't even say county, the base unit is appointed by the president. Vice chancellors of universities, hospitals is appointed by president, which is ridiculous. So if there's any problem going on down there to the market woman or the village person or the child who's going to secondary school who can't access, whatever, if it doesn't get to the president for him to change or make a change, that problem will not be solved. Now, because the president has all the power and because politicians have all the power, for the structure to change, you are asking those politicians to willingly choose to let go of some of that power, which human beings being the way that they are will hardly do it. I'm not saying that I'll necessarily be any better when I get there, because power corrupts, isn't it? But the point that I'm making is that if I've been to Cambridge or Oxbridge and I'm filled with all this idealism and passion and things like that, the system is not going to change on its own. And if people like me don't at least try to get into those positions of power to let go of some of that power and bring it down to the people, that would strengthen institutions, strengthen judiciary, give away power so that it's broken up into smaller pieces and the people have greater access to it. It's not going to happen on its own. If you look at all these great countries, America and so on and so forth, they didn't start out the way that they started out. It took process, years for, I would say, benign dictators, quote unquote, to come into power and to develop it so that now in America, regardless of who is president, let's not express opinions on Trump and all of that, but there are strong institutions in place in America now that it doesn't really matter too much who is going to be president in America. America will be America. So it is with many other countries. So I feel that, yes, both because I'm Ghanaian and because I have had the privilege of this privileged education, I think it's important that people like me should move in towards those spaces if you are so exposed. It's not only political power that you can make change, of course. You can make change in whatever avenue or area that you choose to be in, academia or whatever. But from where I sit in my country, the most change, the most dramatic, the most quick change that you make, unfortunately, resides in the hands of political power. Even if I don't run for president, definitely I want to get into somebody's cabinet or at least the head of some institution where I can rewrite rules and make it better for people coming along. So it doesn't depend on individual strong men to come and take us back 100 years again when the wrong person gets into power.
Okay, I'll keep you in check. Esther.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for your contribution. So I'd just like to say something. Now, when we speak about change, while I was preparing for this session, something crossed my mind and I asked myself, change at what level? And I think that speaks to the whole idea of being part of politics. So when we think of how change at what level, so obviously we know that political leadership is able to influence change at a really large scale and a really broader scale. However, like Kwabena said, it's not the only way. And this is where I would like to also speak to this question by also talking about how it's not necessarily philanthropy. So the problems we face on the continent are problems that are legitimate on their own rights. And it's not just you, and that's why we need to be really careful that you're not just coming as, okay, someone who has all of these ideas, and you think you just come to the continent and you want to impose these ideas. You need to understand the local context. So beyond the desire for change, understanding the context is also really important in effecting whatever change that you seek to effect. And this is where negotiation comes into play. And at what, you need to also decide, at what stage do I want to begin to implement whatever ideas that I have? Do I want to begin with the grassroots, at the grassroots level, or do I want to just go straight up to the political stage? But you must realize the challenges that doing either, the challenges you're going to face if you choose to do either. Now, someone also said, I don't remember, about how effecting change is really about, are you doing that in accordance or in communication with like-minded people? And as a Nigerian, this is something that is a problem in the political scene in Nigeria, where one person may have amazing ideas, but they may be frustrated if the other people on the political scene do not subscribe to these ideas. And that might be a challenge. So we could choose to start, if you choose to go back to the continent, for example, and do something that you think is great, you could choose to start from the grassroots level, for example, understand what are the problems that they are facing. How do they perceive these problems? Where do they want this change to happen beyond like our idealism and what we think is best? And I think that's also really important. And I'm just going to quickly cite this example that, okay, I attended a session and someone said, okay, because there are many Africans in the diaspora who are willing to do something for their respective countries in the continent. But she said something that what she has realized is a problem is that it's beyond the intention. So someone donated, I think, a set of computers to a school in Nigeria, for example, and she just bought the computers and sent it to the school, and that was it. There was no, it would have been best if try to find out what are the skills of the teachers in the schools in the first place. Do they have the capability to teach technological skills, computer-based skills to the students? Is that the problem or the gap in that school at the moment? So it's really a combination of, yes, idealism, but also local engagement with the context. And I think it's also, so if we understand it from that perspective, it's not necessarily philanthropy, because philanthropy means doing something that would, okay, definitely be appreciated, whether they need it or not. But on solving a problem or effecting a change means that you need to be doing something that can be contextually relevant and significant.
Okay, thank you so much, Esther, for that. Just to make a note, if you want to ask a question, please press the raise hand button on your Zoom so that we can take your question. So Akinola, over to you for your question.
Hi, so my name is Akinola. I'm not affiliated with Oxford or Cambridge. I'm a first-year PhD student in molecular biology at the European Molecular Biology Laboratories, and I'm from Nigeria. So a lot of the conversations we have today literally places the onus on the individuals, but my question is, in designing a system that will benefit other people, other scholars to return to the country, how do you ensure that there are financial, social, and economic incentives? Because as a scientist, about 4 years ago, I realized I can't go back to Nigeria for my research. There isn't a stem cell facility on the continent, like power goes out every now and then. It would literally stop my growth as a scientist. So it hurt me to realize that I can't grow in Nigeria, but everyone has been telling me come back home. And I'm sure that's the same for many people. So how do we ensure that we create these systems beyond just talking about whether or not it's our responsibilities to go home? How do we ensure we have the systems that are not just socially beneficial, but also economically beneficial for all of us to go back home? Because many people will go home if there are the systems in place for them to excel. Many people will study in our local universities and wouldn't have to go back to our ex-colonialists to go study. So my question is, what do you all think needs to be done on a larger scale to ensure that for those who want to go home, they can go home and excel? Because it's nice for me to go home, but I wouldn't go home within the next 10 years because I cannot grow back home in Nigeria.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatiola. A very pressing issue. I don't know who would the other speakers would like to respond to that. Arana, okay.
Yeah, so it's actually one of the notes that I made, during my speech. It's a very, very important issue. I think the short answer would be that that's why I started by saying that it all starts with a mindset. And I'm glad that Akinola has the heart that he would really like to go home, but it's not practical. And like I acknowledged in the beginning, it won't be practical for everybody at any point in time. But if you start with a mindset that this end goal of going back home is a good thing, and I want to pursue it at some point in time in my life, I think that's the most important thing. The second most important thing would be then once you've set that goal for yourself, you start working towards it. Because we are at different stages and we are in different industries and we have different country context and things like that, not all of us can go back at exactly the same time because of circumstances. But I can say that if we all make it a point that we want to, you can work towards it. And what do I mean by work towards? I'll give two quick examples. So in Ghana, for example, I'm a doctor, and I had quite a number of Ghanaian doctors in the diaspora that I looked up to. I'll give two quick contrasting examples. There's one example of a doctor based in who was based in Germany. He's one of my heroes. He's called Professor Frimpong Boateng. He's a heart surgeon. So he finished medical school in the late 70s to early 80s, moved to Germany to go and train to become a heart surgeon because there's no opportunities to train to become a cardiothoracic surgeon in Ghana. Excelled very well in Germany and spent about 10 years there. So interesting that you mentioned that 10 years in your timeline, Akinola. But he made it, I read his autobiography, and he made it a point that I am not going to stay in this country. My people need me. And so throughout his whole time there, his whole plan had been geared towards, I'm moving back to Ghana, I'm moving back to Ghana, I'm moving back to Ghana. And it wasn't easy. I mean, every other year during his residency, he would visit Ghana, try and make contact with his old classmates. People told him all sorts of nonsense. I mean, at a point, I mean, we are Black people, let's be frank with ourselves. In fact, when he eventually moved back, it was like, who are you, this, the Ghanaian expression is bogger. Bogger is like somebody who has gone outside and said, who are you, this bogger, to come and tell us what to do kind of year. He was told all sorts of nonsense. He had to stay, it was very bad. But the point that I'm making is that eventually, because he was convicted and he had made that his end goal, he didn't take any mortgages when he was in Germany, no long-term things. I mean, all those things that trap us as Africans when we are there. You will now take a mortgage, private school for your children, which are all good things. It's not bad, but let's face it, those are your mindset with which you approach your life abroad will be different depending on what your goal is. So he ended up in Ghana, set up the first cardiothoracic center in Ghana, and it's now one of the centers of excellence, training people from Nigeria, Ghana, all over West Africa in heart surgery, and it's thriving. And even then, there were issues, people took it away from him, the government, anyway. So point is, he made it his point to come back home, and eventually he came back home and made change. There's another example of somebody else who actually stayed, and he's still there. He's also a professor of orthopedic surgeon, which is back surgery. He's based in New York, one of the top surgeons in New York. He chose to stay because for whatever reason, he chose to stay. He also has made some impact. He set up Focus. It's one of the top centers for orthopedic surgery in Ghana. But the point, and the interesting thing about his story is that he needed people back home to set it up. Because like the example that Esther gave, he had been sending equipment, it will be there, somebody will steal it, people will sell it, people will make all sorts of promises. I mean, if you have diasporan uncles and aunts, even building a house, they'll send money home, people, so the truth of the matter is that if we don't have a critical mass of people back home, which in this case, Professor Boakye was lucky and fortunate to find very solid, professionals in Ghana who were able to help his vision come to pass. Now he's making a big impact because he's able to do surgeries, sometimes free, for people from all over Africa, Ethiopia. My brother works in his hospital, so that's why I know that example, from all over Africa, where they have free surgeries on their spine and things like that. But it's only working because there are solid people back home in Ghana who made it work. So I guess the point that I'm making is that, yes, the reality is we may not have the immediate answers, we may not have the structures at home now. If you decide that I'm going to be a change maker, or I'm going to be a pioneer in my field, and so I'm going to do whatever it takes to get to the level where I have the clout, where I have the network, like Professor Frimpong Boateng did, where I can bring those things, those change to be. Even if it takes 10, 15, however long it takes me, I'm going to make that change. You can then begin to work towards that. But if you don't set that goal and it's like, oh, I want to help, but it's not there, and I mean, let me just stay my own small corner, mind my business, help my family, and it's all good. I mean, Africa needs the repatriation money that we get. I mean, I think in Ghana, our largest foreign exchange earner is the the money that people send from, so it's not a bad thing, and don't feel guilty about it. But I just want us to be conscious of the fact that the amount of change that you want to make, there are different levels of it, and you have to be conscious of how much change you want to make and work towards it at the end of the day. So you don't, so you are satisfied with what you do with your life at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks so much, Kavena, for that. Any other speaker would like to answer that? Okay, Gilbert.
The specific question that was asked, my reading of it was something more, specific and systemic, that how do we make sure that people who want to come back and have all of these bright ideas actually have a system that they can plug into to make sure that when they're coming back, whatever ideas or whatever hopes and dreams they have can then be fulfilled. And what does, I think, to extend it or extrapolate, what does that system look like? And for me, the answer only comes from a network's point of view, in that, are there people in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Africa, who I'm able to connect to when I'm planning to come back? And how do I get support from these kinds of people so that I can easily transition back into the market? Or are there even people in the UK, in New York, in wherever, who would be able to offer me opportunities that would send me back home, so that I'm not in a position where I'm coming back home, but I can't even earn a reasonable wage, or I can't get a job? Because the reality is, for example, in the academic space here, many of us come back and we are shunned because we are either too expensive, or we think we have this high and mighty degree and people think we want all the money in the world. And we obviously also have expectations therefrom. So the thing is, how do we develop this network? And the example that I see and that just popped in my mind is the Harambee Entrepreneurship Alliance. I don't know if we've heard of it. I'm not part of it. I've never worked, I've never been affiliated to it, but I see it as the kind of people who want to bring entrepreneurs who are not on the African continent, but have an African background back on the African continent to offer solutions. But what I would say is, coming out of this Oxbridge conversation is, yes, for example, we have, I think in Kenya, we have the Cambridge Kenya Society. So the Cambridge and Oxford Society in Kenya, which offers a scholarship at St. Anthony's College in Oxford, and I think another college in Cambridge. But the question for us would be, are we willing to come together to start creating and developing an alliance, a network of people who will say, I'm going to be present, I'm going to introduce you to people, I'm going to help you with blah, 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 I'm going to give you a leg up. There's some sort of support you get, so that it's not just blindly stabbing in the dark, but that you have some sort of support wherever you're coming from, wherever you are, or the country that you're going back to. Otherwise, you go back to some sort of isolation, essentially, where you had this entire idea of who you are and what the world looks like, and then you come back to Kenya and it's just a rude awakening on what your experience is, and you're like, I should have stayed where I was or found something else to do then, or I never want to come back here again. Because there's some people who do come back and then say, oh no, this was a mistake, I'm going back to where I came from, because this is certainly not working for me. So I think that only comes from all of us here in this call, and speaking to the Africa Oxford Society, and also speaking to the Africa Society of Cambridge, and saying, guys, how do we come together and actually form this network, this alliance of past and present scholars who are able to support one another and coming back, and what's a shared vision of what it looks like? And maybe if we do have a shared vision, then we're able to support one another in that journey. I think that's what I'd say. And now that Akinola is not in Oxford or Cambridge, how do we include him in that conversation as well, to make sure that he also gets a part of participating in that journey of change? Those are just my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. We only have 5 minutes left, and we still have a number of things to say. Well, I'll just say, in case you have to leave at the 4 o'clock dot, you might take a few minutes afterwards. Just thank you so much for participating. This has been an incredible conversation, very thought-provoking and also action-provoking. We'll just take a few more questions and then we'll have to round up and call it quits for today. Please also take note that we have 3 more conversations in this series. There's one on Wednesday, another one next week Sunday, and another one next week Wednesday. And you can check the Africa Oxbridge page. We'll give you all the details there. So thanks so much for that. Okay, Cynthia, you had a comment.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad I got to ask a question. So this is actually follow-up to one of the comments that Kwabena made previously, and Kwabena doesn't have to answer this, any of the speakers can answer. But so this is on the topic of going into politics. And this is something that I've personally been thinking about recently as well. So yes, I also shared the idea that, politics is where we can have the biggest influence and make the biggest change. And I also believe, I think there's this quote that says, bad things happen because good people do nothing. And so I think it's something I'm definitely interested in doing much later down the line in my career, going into politics. But then I think the thing that I've been thinking about is that going into Nigerian politics is like going into a broken system, where when you go in there, it's really easy to get away with fraud or, just get away with wrongdoing because, there aren't really all those checks. And I say this especially because of the recent NDDC scandal. I don't know if all of you have heard about it. So this is the Niger Delta Development Commission, which is in charge of helping to bring reformation and restoration to the Niger Delta region, which has been exploited because, that's where the oil in Nigeria comes from. But, the people who are in charge of this ended up sort of exploiting, the resources that were supposed to go towards the community. And so this is like an 80 billion naira fraud. So this is really massive. And I kind of looked into it a bit, and it turns out that the managing director, who's at the forefront of this, is actually someone who completed a PhD in microbiology at the University of Nottingham. So essentially, he is like us. This is exactly, he's probably in our shoes. Maybe he had this conversation too. And so, that just keeps ringing that question. How do we, when we then go into politics, how do we sort of stay true to the purpose and to that ethics, to good ethics and to that vision that we're pursuing? How do we make sure that we don't sort of go into the sort of bad system that's already existing? So anyone can feel free to answer this.
Okay, thank you very much, Cynthia. Any takers? Any of our speakers would like to respond?
I can go.
I just wanted to check because you've spoken a bit.
Yeah,
well, Esther, would you like to go?
Esther is great. She said.
Yeah, let Esther go and then you, Gilbert, can go. Yeah. Esther, unmute yourself.
I'm sorry guys. So thank you, Cynthia, for the question, and thank you for the meeting speakers, Gilbert, Kwabena, and Akinola for your previous question. So yes, this is a very, very, very sensitive question. I ask myself this question a lot regarding the political situation in Nigeria. So I think that it's not really that question of how do we stick to our ethics or the morals and ensuring that we don't get pulled into the the surrounding of corruption and all of that is a very critical one. But what I'd like to say is we need to realize that you can't single-handedly do something great. You need a community, you need a group of people. You need people on the same team as you, who think like you, who believe in that vision to be able to push any meaningful change to make any meaningful change possible. But what I would like to say is if we do decide to go into the political scene, one, I think Kwabena has said this, she has said it a couple of times, a critical mass of like-minded people is essential on the continent. So we need to have a conversation with one another. How many of us are truly willing to go back to the continent if you have decided? And there's something I also struggle with, because I feel like even here in Cambridge, in as much as we're Africans, I feel like everyone is just on their own, more or less, trying to figure this thing called life and post-PhD out. So I could go back to the continent and no one would know if I'm in Nigeria or not, even though I was in Cambridge with everyone else. So okay, for those of us who are graduating, what is the next thing for you? What is the long-term goal? And having that team is important. And if we do make this transition to the continent, it's important that you understand your why. What is important to you? Now, it may not always be supported by people in Nigeria, for example, in the political scene, but nevertheless, because in as much as we want to be change agents or we're nationals of this country, we're still individuals. So you need to recognize that who you are as a person is what matters as well. What staying true to your values and what is important to you will always be known wherever in the world. So even if you're in a bad system, but you were known as Cynthia, who always stood for this or for that, that in itself is a contribution and a value in itself. So staying true to your purpose, staying true to your why, regardless of, even though it could be tough, even though you might want to give up, but even if when you give up, you were known to have stuck to your gun and stay true to what is important to you. And in the end, we can just only hope, because I always tell myself, even when I was a teacher, that even if it's one person I end up influencing in my class at the end of my period here, that is good enough for me. And do not take it for granted. You might not know the number of people you're influencing as a result of speaking out or speaking against something, but you're surely influencing someone somewhere, even though you have no idea who they are. So it's just important to stay true to what you believe in.
Okay, Gilbert, can we just have a 1-minute comment from you?
Yeah, just really quick. If you want to go into politics, my thinking is find capacity building experiences, find mentors, find practical training for that, but also find experiences that would help you out. And I've seen a lot of it in terms of women going into politics in Kenya, because that's something that I've been fairly close in terms of supporting. And the idea has always been find women who are already in politics to work with the women who want to go into politics and who will share the real experiences of what that looks like, so that you understand what exactly it is you want to go into and what sorts of challenges people like you are facing. So capacity building, I think, is really, really important for people, especially scholars who are coming from Oxbridge, going back into their countries and are interested in participating in politics. And that's obviously if you haven't done it. Also, we have former scholars who are participating in politics. I know there's someone in South Africa who was elected. I knew him a while back, haven't been in touch, but I think the South Africans in the call know him, who was in Oxford, I think finished his PhD as well, and then went back and is in politics.
Okay, thanks, Gilbert. So we have a question from YouTube. I don't know, I think we just have one scholar to take this. We won't be able to change Africa much if we continue to allow our former colonial masters to frustrate Pan-African efforts. What is the expected response from the international community to a Pan-African push, especially from the likes of historical bullies like US and China? Anybody would like to take this? We won't be able to change Africa much if we continue to allow our former colonial masters to frustrate Pan-African efforts. What is the expected response from the international community to a Pan-African push, especially from the likes of historical bullies like US and China? Any takers, speakers? Okay, Esther?
Okay, well, I'm not so much of a political, and as in, I don't know so much about the international politics, but I'm just going to try to say something about this. I was having a discussion recently with a friend, and I said something that I think for we Africans, we focus so much on saying it exists, that yes, our efforts are being frustrated by the global north, and okay, Westerners and Asians. However, rather than just staying focused on complaining that they're in our way, how well are we doing? How well on our own are we trying to advocate for change on the continent? So if we just focus on this is what we want to do, this is the idea we're pushing, this is the movement we're pushing, and focus solely on that idea rather than focusing on the detractors and why we're not able to do this, then at some point the detractors rather will begin to pay attention to, okay, these guys really mean business, this is what they really want to do here, so okay, let's listen. So if we all pay attention to what it is that we want to do and the idea of change or systemic change or social change, economic or political change or reformations that we want to do on the continent, how about we just pay attention to that first, rather than just keep focusing on so many detractors, because they'll always be there. they're not going anywhere. They'll always be there. But I think at some point, if we just focus on the idea of change that we want to do on the continent and agree, first off, because I think another problem we have is we don't even agree on the idea of meaning of change we want to have on the continent. We all have disparate ideas of what we want to do in the education sector, in the political sector. If we can all agree, and this is where the concept of ideology comes in, having a common ideology of what we hope would thrive in the respective sectors in Africa, if we can all agree on that, then it becomes clear that this is what we want to do, and everyone comes on board and just pushes that agenda forward. That's what I have to say.
Okay, thank you so much, Esther. Trevor had a comment, so we'll just take that briefly, and I think at that we'll have to just cut the conversation short, unfortunately.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. This has been a very insightful conversation. Just want to talk about the framing around change and what change looks like. Gilbert has talked about it a little bit. I think we tend to overstate or the grandiose around, the likes of, some of the former prime ministers, some of the alumni who have passed through the Oxbridge program. We want to implement that type of level of change. And I think, in my view, if we reframe it differently, I think change could look like something even just like teaching at a school. Change could look like, you're just creating a community, organization in your community or something of that sort. So I think that also takes a bit of the pressure off. And I think as well, in terms of overstating like the individual, the individual power of like making change, I think we have seen historically, institutional change and some of these structural changes are so hard to do as an individual. Barack Obama, as an individual, could not, in his 10 years, create like institutional change, in the US. We see it in Ethiopia as well with Abiy Ahmed. So we should move away from the individual, and I just want to echo some of the sentiments around building a network of sharing experiences, and also just like doing it as a group, like as a mass. So yep, that's my comment for now.
Okay, so thank you so much, everybody. Today has been a very interesting conversation. Once again, thank you to all the speakers. Thanks to Noxolo, to Esther, to Grace, to Gilbert, and to Kwabena. Thanks to all the organizers. Thanks to Simfiwe, to Alice, to Julian, to Temitope, to Stephen, to Cynthia, for all their work. Today has given us a lot to think about. I think there are no easy answers to the questions that we've put on the table today. Life is real. We have our personal responsibilities to ourselves, to our families. We have our individual well-being, our dreams and our hopes and our aspirations. And many times, let's be real, it can be tough to realize this on the African continent. But I think at the same time, all of us here have been given incredible opportunities, even by the fact that we've been able to get an education, and also to get an education at one of the best institutions of the world. And to be given so much power, we have a responsibility to use it well. And I think something that I've taken away from this conversation is that, one, change is not going to come overnight. It comes in little steps, and it comes from people working in different sectors. There's a role for people in politics. There's a role for people at the grassroots. So everybody has their role to play, and it doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be grandiose. It could be the little things. It could be in diaspora. It could be back home. We need those networks of people who have access to certain resources in diaspora, and people who are able to implement things on the ground. But I think what's important is, one, having that mindset of wanting to give back what we've been given so much of back to our continent, and beginning to, based on that mindset, beginning to make actions to be able to carry out our dreams and our goals and our hopes for our continent. And I think even more important is working together. We can't do this alone. We need to come hand in hand together to be able to make our dreams of seeing our continent what it should be like, making it a reality. So having that mindset and working together, I think for me, have been huge takeaway points from this conversation. And I think working together starts right here in dialogues like this, where we come and discuss and thrash ideas and discuss with each other. And it's not going to stop today. They have one on Wednesday, they have one on Sunday, and we have one next Wednesday. So hope to see you all there. I don't know if you have anything to add, Cynthia.
No, you said it all. Yeah, thank you to everyone who's participated in this.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Have a wonderful week, everyone.
You too. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.